Seminar 3 we started, we said that no one comes without Hakdumis. What we meant by that is that no one comes without Hakdumis, meaning when we read a text, we have our own, we come with our Chinuch, how to read the text, which also means to say, on the basic level, that if I'm going to read the Pri Uretz as psychology, I'm going to understand it through a psychoanalytical or a psychological lens, a difference, but for our purposes the same. If I'm going to read it through mysticism, I'm going to understand it as mysticism. If I'm going to read it as Chassidische Torah, whatever that means, which is ostensibly what we're trying to do, then I understand the Pri Uretz as Chassidische Torah. And we read out philosophy, I'll sound like philosophy. So in other words, it's my lens, putting the way I'm coming with my Chinuch, or what I expect to even see in the text. That is how I'm going to read it through. And the point of view we're saying is we should understand that we're coming with our lenses and have our lens challenged a different way. There's a flip side of this also, which is the same way that we're coming with our understanding, the text itself has its own understanding. In other words, whenever somebody is writing a position or coming up with a position, coming up with a new etzad or whatever, it's trying to write something new. And by definition, he's saying something different than has been said until now. If I'm not repeating myself, I'm not repeating somebody else, I'm saying something new. In that case, I'm saying something which didn't exist before, or wasn't brought out the same way before. So I'm saying something which is a chiddush, and therefore I'm reacting against the things which are not what I'm saying. Right? The same way when I'm reading something, I'm coming with my hanuchas. The actual text, when I'm saying something which I believe was not said until now, I'm trying to say it means this and not something else. So in other words, I can only understand, let's go back to the Chinuch, where we spoke, right? So I only, according to the way we were learning the Chinuch, the Pri Uretz, I only understand what the Chinuch meant if I understand that he does not, the way we explained that, he's not speaking about behaviorism, plain simple behaviorism. I only understand meaning, in other words, the text itself was written not as something else, only as this. So even if I believe I can have positive knowledge, I can know what something is. There's a whole shitta, which maybe we'll get to one day, and I don't mean postmodernism like in Derrida and that. In Pushet, to say is that I only know what something is not. It's the modern way of reading Hegel. But the end of the day here is, even if I can have a positive, I can know what something is, I can only know what it is by knowing what it is not. I give the Mushalat, let's pretend you have an alien that comes down in this earth, he never ever saw a car. So I want to explain to what a car over here a car is. So I'm going to show him a car outside. He still thinks a bicycle is a car. It's a vehicle, it travels, it has wheels. A truck is a car, everything's the same. You have to show him this is a car, this is not a car, this is not a car, and this is not a car. This is a van, this is a bus, this is a different vehicle. And hopefully himself have a positive knowledge of what it is. So the mitzvah is to know what something is, you have to know what it is not. Right? So in that case, if I want to understand, for instance, the lishma from the Pri Uretz, we were discussing the shloi lishma, the Pri Uretz, right? Then I have to know what he means by luchaf atzma, right? Even though he doesn't want to go do it, and what does he not mean? What is not considered part of luchaf atzma? To have positive knowledge, I need to have negative knowledge of what it's not. Which means also that whenever somebody is saying a drusha, a shir, a lecture, whatever it is, he's reacting to something. No one does not react to anything. Everything is a reaction. So if we understand what we're reacting to, we understand better what we are trying to say. So with this small hagdume, we're going to go into this. Somebody once gave a lecture. It's more than one lecture thing, but it's basically, as I'm going to say, I'd be charitable. I'm going to make it as strong, as solid as could be. I'm trying to steel man him, even though it's not necessarily mesidic. And we're going to see what he's reacting from. If his reaction, meaning what's he trying to take away, what's he trying to take out, what's he trying to say, the negative, what it's wrong. Whatever, for lack of a better word, I can't think of a good English translation. And then we're going to take it from there. You see how it ties into everything we're discussing until now. So, the flip side with this over here is that because everybody is reacting to something, it means that you can react. Your reaction is correct. In other words, you detected a problem, you detected an issue, so your reaction was good. But it doesn't mean that what you understood, your solution was correct. Right? So in other words, the position you rejected could be right, but you can fall into the same error by accepting by embracing an opposite position, which is wrong. So, this lecturer's issue was, what he took the task is, that what became today, that kavuna, or לשמה, is the religious emotional feeling that's b'shas doing a mitzvah. On his reading, according to that, to do this understanding, according to this picture, a mitzvah has two layers. It has external act, we do the mitzvah, and then it has the inner layer, which is a personal, private feeling the person has while he's doing the mitzvah. And that is what we term לשמה. This is actually a common perception that, by Chassidim, this might, and we try to caricature the literature, like what's meant the kauta litvak. Besides is, it did the mitzvah like it's supposed to be finished, he does the mitzvah, so the Torah says, and that's that. Havarim, achusid, it does it with abren, that is a kavuna. By correcting a kauta litvak, we say he's missing that inwards emotional connection to the mitzvah, missing the lishma, and that is he's only doing the external action, right? So there's external action, and then there is the internal lishma chaylik. That is what he's reacting to. So the reason, if we view a mitzvah like this, then we basically say that a mitzvah is a shell. It's an inert object. It's a shell. It's a chayfetz, which only gets life, only gets invigorated by the kavuna of the person. So we're separating the external act from the internal feeling. And this, Tanata, is a big problem. Why? Because if you view it this way, then we have an issue. What is the actual point of a mitzvah? In other words, what exactly is the mitzvah? If the mitzvah is really the internal feeling, then that sort of negates the whole outward, the whole action, because it's not really negaya. It's anyways how the person feels. What is the point of all the mitzvahs? So if somebody, not only that, that means to say is that just have the bren without even really doing the mitzvah. Okay, it's good as ochet. I mean, you did even more importantly than the mitzvah itself. That is the issue by our model, is a relatively commonly accepted model, is that is what a mitzvah is. So Maila, the lecture Tana, that no, a mitzvah is not an empty exterior, it's not just a chitzoini, it's not just a masa, it's something else. Well, what is it? So, it all came to Naizach, that he believes he's going back to Aristotle, which we have spoken about the concept of the telos, the what for. I think that's what a mitzvah is. Now, let's unpack this a bit more. So I try to clean it and try to get to the root of what he's trying to say. That he claims that since modernity, especially since Descartes, that we lost the concept of telos. In other words, we used to, let's look at a tree, right? A tree is a tree which is growing outside. What is a telos? What is a point? So it's precisely is because we now view a tree as an inert material matter that we find it very hard to speak about it as it has a telos, it has a point, it has a thing which is trying to go for. The thing over here is, in Aristotelian understanding, every single thing which has the four causes doesn't necessarily mean the tree is actively in the mind, it has a mind and is trying to become a tree, the treeness, meaning to grow the best that's possible for a tree. It doesn't actively try to do it, but ultimately, when we say this is a good tree and this is a bad tree, it means to say is that it is trying to become, not necessarily consciously, but what it is becoming, what it grows to, and it grows into, is the epitome of, the epitome of a tree, of treeness, and that is what a good tree is, a bad tree. A bad tree is one which does not fulfill, not so much as tafkid as in like it has with the cycle, but it does not fulfill the point, the concept of treeness. So that is what a telos means. Telos means to say is the end, what it is for. Now, don't I say again, doesn't necessarily be a conscious trying to grow into a tree, but the Mitzvah says it's supposed to be growing into a tree. That is what its end result over here is. Let's think of a watch. A watch, the point of a watch is to tell time. If it tells time well, accurately, it is a good watch. If it does not tell time correctly, it's a bad watch. That doesn't mean bad, it's morally bad, as in they definitely put him into the corner, he didn't do a good job. Obviously, it's not what I mean. We say, yes, as far as a watch, qua watch, it is not doing a good job, it is not a good watch. So that is what telos means. And
Because the Aristotle, what telos of a person is to develop a psyche.
the telos of a person is to develop
A psyche. The intellect, or the...
So the question, I agree and I don't agree. I don't know what you mean by develop per se. In other words, develop to. It's in other. It could develop on sounds as we're not. You mean say to acquire the best intelligence. So yes and no. There's a shikul stira. I'm not sure I want to get to it. There is a shikul stira in Aristotle himself between the beginning of book 10 in the Nicomachean Ethics, but and every single entity in the world has its own telos, precisely what it is. But the point of it here is that the definition of the word is what its telos is. In other words, it's not that we have a tree and there's something external to it makes it a good tree. The definition of a tree is to be a good tree, to be a tree. So if let's the watch and the shikul easy to understand, even though that's the difference between intrinsic and extrinsic. We're not going to get too much into it today, so it's fine. Next week we're going to have to differentiate, because that's actually one of the problems that this lecturer has. He's mixed in categories. But that said, let's say a watch, right? So a watch which is intended to tell time. If it does not tell time accurately, it is a bad watch, right? But because the definition of the watch is to tell time. If it doesn't tell time accurately, then it's not doing what its definition is. So it's not that the telos is extrinsic, is something that I have a watch, and somebody came and told you to be a good watch, you have to tell time correctly. That's not what a watch is. It's the definition of a watch is to tell time correctly. So it's very important to understand that telos is the definition of the item, of the thing itself. And therefore, it's not something extrinsic. The definition of a tree is to grow into the best tree that it can be under this circumstance, in this type of tree, whatever it is. That's the definition of a tree. And that is why the best tree is its definition itself, not two separate things. That's very important. So, Tanata, once telos disappeared and we became a natural, mechanistic worldview, which things are just considered go by itself, then what happened over here is that there's no such concept of the thing, because telos is the definition of the thing. So if we lose the concept, this idea, if we don't understand that what makes something good is its own definition, then we lose the actual character of the thing. It means it's just what happens over here. It becomes a chayfetz. A tree is a tree. Not that a tree is a tree, a good tree is a grows. A watch is a watch. And then we give it a new moral, and then we have an empty shell. We have empty nothing, because the definition is what makes it good. If we lose this understanding of the telos, of the definition, that's what makes it what it is. If we lose this understanding, in that case we have an empty object, and we filled it in with kavuna, meaning with our internal feeling, our internal meaning. So a mitzvah, which laws is the definition of what makes a mitzvah. We'll explore that a bit more in this context. And we then have just an empty shell, empty action. We have an action called mitzvah. And we filled it in with kavuna, with our emotive feeling. And that is what happens. So lamasa, and as we said before, that's a problem, because basically then we sort of completely discarded the concept of the mitzvah, because it's an empty action. It's no different to one mitzvah, any action. It's an empty action. And it's only the kavuna. That means what the Torah proscribed something. We'll see in a second, his attack on the Ramban, exactly why he felt that. We'll get that in a second. So either way, is that we have to reverse this big problem which happened, and we have to say that we have to understand that the mitzvah itself is the Torah-form. The way the Torah prescribed it, doing it correctly, is the definition of doing a good mitzvah, of doing it lishma. Lishma is not something outside an eternal feeling, I feel, of doing it nicely, of doing it correctly, doing it mitzvahs. Lishma simply means doing it for what it is. Same way the lishma, quote unquote, of a watch is telling good time, telling time well. That's the lishma of a mitzvah also. That's all it is. So it has nothing to do with sahavas, this external category which has no shaykhs to the telos, to the actual concept of the mitzvah. It is simply doing the mitzvah as the Torah-form, because the Torah-form itself is not empty. That's the definition of the mitzvah. Now, it sounds very nice, and the next step, what he did here there's been multiple lectures, but this is putting together. So now that means the Torah does not deal with empty, neutral concepts, right? In other words, when the Torah says that there's a concept of desire, and Torah says use desire only for these types of things, and don't use desire for other types of things, right? Certain foods I don't allow. It's not pshat because there's an overarching thing of desire, and you can eat certain foods and certain foods don't eat. In other words, that's right. We call it quantitative as opposed to qualitative. It's not pshat is that the treif is a different. In other words, there are two ways to view this right now, right? So now, if I view this that each mitzvah proscribes itself by its definition, then when the Torah says that you're not allowed to eat treif, and you're allowed to eat something which is not treif, doesn't mean that it is an overarching concept of eating, of tave, of wanting to eat something. And the Torah says you could train it that only have a qualitative, a change of amount of tave, that and only for these things allowed to only do that thing. No, once it took on a Torah-form, a form that the Torah prescribed, then the tave to eat kosher things is a different form, it's a qualitative difference than the tava to eat treif. Which means to say is, there's a famous Ramban in Parshas Kedoshim. Ramban is asked is bothered with the question. What's this question? The question is, Shak Kedoshim Tiyeh. Now, we have a whole Torah without Parshas Kedoshim, meaning if we don't let's go into Parshas Kedoshim, we already know we have a Torah which prescribes what we can do, what we cannot do. So this whole concept of Kedoshim Tiyeh seems to be an issue, because what's it supposed to mean now, Kedoshim Tiyeh? But yes, I'm doing the Mitarig mitzvahs, and I think, what's the separate proscription of Kedoshim Tiyeh? Is there a Ramban Mechadish, seems like a Chedish, a concept of being a menivel, which is a Torah. That, in other words, the Ramban understands, the Ramban is saying is that even if you do everything we in the Torah, we can still be the same menivel, a scoundrel, with a shis Torah. Why? Because I'm eating what I'm allowed to, I'm doing exactly what the Torah says. All Tarig mitzvahs, look at the Ramban, doesn't make a difference. You still are a menivel b'reshis Torah. So Kedoshim Tiyeh means to say is the basic understanding of means go above and beyond what the Torah says. Be magdiris of kadosh and through there you'll be able to train yourself. So Tanater, I'm not going to repeat his language because I don't understand. I mean, edition is still edition. If you don't understand it, you don't speak like that Rishonim. But the essence of what he's saying, not his words, to paraphrase basically, is to cut out the whatever. That basically is, look, the Ramban nicht verstanden, the Ramban does not understand, doesn't understand that the Torah and mitzvah is a form, the Tave for Treifis is nicht selbe Tave for Machulim Metirim. It's not, the Ramban understands that desire is a button, is the thing that the person has desire, and therefore the Torah is trying to, and you understand the Torah is saying that how much you're allowed to have. So they would say, let's go even less is like No. If you have the Dan Tave is only for kosher thing, there's no problem with it. It's a qualitative difference because the form of a mitzvah is what is good. The Torah zog that make essen treife. That means they're not allowed to eat treife. So if you have a desire for treife, that's an issue. But if you have a desire for kasher, something which is kosher to eat, that's not a problem. That is the definition. That's a form. That is a form of doing an action. The form, the essence of the thing is doing this action. Once we come and understand, that we add telos back into the world, and we say that everything, the definition of good and bad is the definition of what it is. To be a good watch means to tell time correctly. To do the mitzvah, the form of the mitzvah, the Torah-form, is what makes it good by definition. It's not shak to say that it's a qualitative difference. It's a quantitative difference, and therefore it can be more b'tav. No, if your tav is a kusha, it's fine, nish. The Rambam himself, unless in the 6th Pahadik Shmona Perukim, where he says his twist on the Bani Sadi Guin. But once again, right now, this is how we understand it. So, in his mind, the Rambam made a huge mistake, completely didn't, because they understand also, he made this mistake, he say is, if according to the Ramban, then he understands the whole concept of the Shema wrong, the whole concept of good and bad wrong, because if you tell me that thing, the etzmet Torah-form is not good, it's not the definition. That means that you're going back to basically, you lost the whole telos. The telos only got lost in modernity. Under the shala, Again, there's But either way, his big payoff is okay. Yes, can verstehen mitach shloi lishma bu lishma. Why? We have a problem mitach shloi lishma bu lishma. Chassidim fragen sagt it has to be literature wrong. This is what we're repeating it. Not coming from me. It has to be literature wrong. Why it has to be literature wrong? Because we see that they learn Torah and then I don't get anywhere lishma, right? Mizan, that the definition and the Torah, the Gemara is about Lishma. You learn Shlo Lishma, you're going to get to Lishma, and we see that doesn't work. Mizan, our definition of learning Torah Lishma is wrong. No, that's not because no, it's not true. Because ultimately, and it's not very well why it works. Mitzvos is the form, the Torah form of every mitzvah. Is good by essence, right? Because what do we say what good means? Good means its definition. A good watch tells time correctly. That is a thing. So yes, even if you're doing a shaloi lishma, you're still doing a Torah form. You are learning, you're doing mitzvahs, you're doing the form of the Torah, and therefore automatically, eventually, your outside external thing, you want those COVID, fine, but you're still doing the form. The form itself has a mala, has the ability to train the person into a good human being. That's the definition of thing, because again, it's not a quantitative good. It's not that there's one good and goes up and down, like that's this whole attack on the Ramban. Pshat is that there's one concept of tava and the Torah trying to train the only have a decent. No, there is a difference. A tava for a kushan machol is not the same tava for a treif in the machol. It will be for COVID, but the form itself, the actual action that you're doing, is a good action. You're doing a good. So you're doing a good action, but for the wrong reason. But you're doing a good. In other words, let's think add a kmushal, right? Let's say you're taking a watch. A watch should only be money. Let's say a watch is only to tell time, not to be fancy, nice, whatever it is. Lamasa, you're taking it, even if you want it to be nice. Lamasa, you're still doing the form of a watch of telling time. It's not really good musha, but I can on the spot think musha. The point we're saying over here is Lamasa, the form what you're doing is a good form. It's a Torah form. That's the Torah prescribed. The S, you're only eating at the S. The S, not the S, the Kuvot Shabbos, right? The S, the Kuvot Shabbos Kodesh, right? How does it change? Because at the end of the day, Samachul Shabbos. That's allowed. Eventually, you're not going to. I have a question again. What's wrong with it if it's Nishkatav anyways, right? But the basic concept, what he's trying to say. There are many issues with it, but the basic concept, ultimately, what he's trying to say is doing a mitzvah is doing a mitzvah good. Lishma means doing the form itself. So even if you add something else with it, ultimately you're doing the form. You're doing a good form, and that is going correct. But you're doing the form. You're practicing doing the form. The Ramban, you're teaching the kids, the children, to go eat, to go learn, and you're giving them prizes and that. But the masa learning itself is a Torah form of good. And eventually you're going to leave alone the prizes and you can just learn itself because it's literally a piece of a puzzle. You're doing good action. So this is, so before we criticize him, let's understand Lamasa, what does he gain, right? So Lamasa, he says that the concept of shallow, meaning he correctly identifies as an issue. That the problem, so that we say that we can separate the inside and outside and say there's a shell of a mass and it's dependent on the person doing something, right? The mass, he does recognize that. And he says also the concept, the master, that there is a concept of actually doing a mass. It's not just machshuva, there's also a concept of a mass. And he explains habituation. He explains how it trains you to do correctly, right? Also, according to this, you understand the concept of the form, why it's important, right? Because ultimately, it's on the halacha is important to tell them to do the Torah form, right? Whatever that means, right? And importantly, he says that the Torah is not just a list of external restrictions of that. It is a qualitative difference. It changes your life qualitatively. In other words, mitzvos, not just quantitatively, because the Torah form is what is a good action, right? Now, certain parts of the thing, not even a point of taking apart because it's ridiculous. For instance, just saying that if you could call Kant an emotivist, that means you completely misunderstood Kant. And the reason why I want to bring it up is because this is the problem with Chalal. He completely conflates categories. If there's a difference between, when it comes to moral theory, there's at least 4 different aspects. So one of them is where the moral imperative comes from. Second is how we know what it is. He mixes, and then how you feel about doing. Mixing all things together is if you call Kant an emotivist, you could call Aristotle also an emotivist, because also a concept of feeling good. It's just ridiculous. And this is where, if we understand, we add back Telos, we don't have the problem of the Cartesian, the split between the extension and thought. This is actually a bit in the guide today. We're going to pack that bit. The is-ought distinction of Hume is also completely misunderstood. But we're going to get to a few of the things. But what's important, it's not important to take apart all those ancillary points. The only thing which the guy is something which could show the reason why where the mistake goes is going to be important to help us clarify our position as we opened it up at the seminar, right? That they're saying is that to understand what we are saying, understand what we're not saying. So this aspect. So let's take this apart. So, what is the implicit theory underneath this whole understanding? This is what we were discussing last time, behaviorism. Now, he doesn't speak, I highly doubt, I don't think he knows this whole concept, but ultimately, we'll take apart behaviorism, meaning we'll take apart as in, being a taich, as not take apart as in destroy, take apart as in find the intellectual theory underpinnings behind it, and we'll see that ultimately what he's saying is a plain simple form of behaviorism, which we've been arguing against the whole time. So now, why is behaviorism? Now, behaviorism is not stupid. Mitzvos over here is that we do learn from it. We learn as behaviorism, meaning you teach a child that if you do positive reinforcement, then he's going to act better. We teach if you enforce. We gave the mushal that somebody's afraid of heights, and he goes near steps. He gets anxiety, and he gets then trained not to go near steps, and so he doesn't go near and becomes less anxious. So he reinforces himself not to go near steps, and that is the Nodus behavior has something. But let's go, if you go through the literature, meaning read through the primary sources of behaviorism, and try to sort of map out the intellectual landscape and where it came from, what it came out of, what was a reaction to, everything is a reaction to something. I think we'll see that behaviorism is a reaction against Cartesian dualism. What is Cartesian dualism? Basically, again, we're not going to get into the Cartesian philosophy right now, it's a Shnegai right now, maybe a different time. But what's Shnegai, Lunaini, is that Descartes made a very sharp distinction between extension and thought. Right? He starts off that what I could doubt, what I cannot doubt. And the idea here is self-dovid. He comes out and says, what do I know? What do I know with certainty? Or it's not know with certainty. What is a mitzvos? Mitzvos is that a human is composed of 2 aspects. We have the mind, which is the I, the self, the ego. And ego here does not mean the Freudian ego, simply means the self. And we have extension. Extension is plain and simply the body. It has the form of the thing. Now, this obviously brought into a sharp issue which was already latent to many, even to Aristotle. It's always a problem, right? How exactly do they interact? So it's not that he didn't, there's ultimate blame, right? So the Aristotelian concept of hydromorphism, which the actual soul is the form of the matter, it doesn't necessarily, okay, we're getting into all this of the mind-body problem, but the guy that it does make a problem, but this is part of it, that does make brings the problem to sharp relief. Because if there's really 2 separate substances, the form, extension, and thought, then we have an issue. Because the mitzvah is, the issue is, in the sense is, what is the person? The person is a thinking self, which is not matter, not extension. And the mitzvah is that when a person acts, what is acting? Well, it's definitely the extended matter, right? The body, the physical aspect, the extension, that is what's acting. What is thinking? What is thinking to act is the person, the thought, the ego, the self, the I. So how exactly do these 2 interact? Right? That is the basic philosophical mind-body problem. But there's a bigger issue over here. In other words, for a psychological aspect, then the mind is a private matter. I have no idea what the mind is. right? I can't see what anybody else's mind. I only know my mind. And therefore, how exactly do we deal with the concept of the actions and the mind? How am I supposed to study the person if I have no access to it, right? Now, this is an issue. And if it's an issue, it's an issue. I mean, too bad. Right? I mean, if you don't access the person's private thoughts, you don't have access, but all right, that's what it is. However, the behaviorist says that this distinction, this split, which Descartes tried to do, is wrong in his understanding, meaning that yes, we have Pashas two options. Either we say that the real thought, the real person, the real action, what the person's wants and everything is his own private internal feelings, I have no access to it. Or we say, let's leave the thought alone and we're going to go to only actions, right? Now the problem with that over here is the masam tzis is a person thinks. Right? A behavioralist can't say that a person doesn't think because mitzvos, everybody thinks, right? So the behaviorist is saying over here is that the problem here was that Descartes thought they are separate, or gave precedence or credence over the thought to action. That's not true. Mitzvos over here is exactly what we just finished saying, right? Yes, we know theoretically when a person goes near, somebody's afraid of heights and he goes near the edge of the roof, he's afraid, right? And I don't know exactly what he's feeling. However, what I do know is that his actions that he takes, because of this internal fear or internal motive, internal whatever it is something which I can predict. Not only can I predict, the more the behavior reinforces the thought pattern itself. Which means to say is, the behavior is like this. We're not denying thought, and we're not denying that a person thinks. What we're arguing over here is, I'm telling you that you're wrong to say that it is the thought which affects the actual actions to the utmost. We see the opposite. We see the more that we could train the mind to think differently through external actions. So it's not the mind, which we'll study the actions, and the mind follows along afterwards. That is a behaviorist position. So it's external actions retrains the actual mind, right? So we have the Cartesian split, and then we have until behavior always thought of a lot that basically the thought is what makes the action, what the thought is what causes the action. Behavioral says that we see it just the opposite, or at least in a large measure, and therefore we can study actions, and therefore we can train the individual, and that's how the mitzvos. So again, we're going to get to like the genealogy of how it expanded from Pavlov, which was associated behavior, until all the way to Skinner, which is basically he was the main that puts down to the science. But the point is that again we see behavior, and behavior changes the mind. I act, and therefore I act differently. When the child cries because he wants to have this candy, and the parents doesn't allow him to have the candy, that the action, we know through the action of what he's thinking, but it's more not so much we know what he's thinking, it's more that when if the parent gives in and allows him to have the candy, the next time he is almost guaranteed to cry. Why? Because when he wants something, his behavior reinforces thought pattern. Now when he wants something, he is going to cry. And if the parents did not give in, eventually he's going to stop crying and stop complaining. Why? Because our behavioral pattern, the fact that you did not get what you wanted, retrained the mind to think differently and to know that this does not work. Therefore, the behavior is not a stupid position at all. And the Messiah has a lot of truth to it. The outside, the external, retrains the mind. And that is how we all operate. So even if I don't necessarily have access to the actual thought, I know what is going on in your mind through your behavior. That is the position of the behavioralist. Now, the biggest point here is that behaviorists accept the dichotomy. They accept the split between the mind and the body. What they're arguing over here is that the mind follows the body, but that there is this difference, this split. That is an important part. Now, should go to this directly, or what is behavioral missing? This theory, what is it missing? What it's missing is the concept that it thinks that the action itself is a neutral concept. That is where I think let's go through Wittgenstein. Let's go to, so again, obviously we're not going to go through the whole book. It's obviously impossible, and we're just going to try to take out, this actually, most of the passage, actually the very famous passages. I'll explain it as we go along. We're not trying to understand the full position of Wittgenstein right now. The reason why it's important over here is because the lecturer, I remember trying to explain why the lecturer went wrong. This lecturer, Lamase, read Anscombe, I think I mentioned it last week, read Anscombe's book on intention and modern moral philosophy. Now, I'm not going to try to I don't know what he knows, but he doesn't know. But as we'll go through, we'll explain that he clearly misunderstood few very important points from the whole overarching theory of intention and the modern moral philosophy. And whether, because he didn't read Wittgenstein or he didn't understand, I don't know. But the Messias over here is that Anscombe was a student from Wittgenstein. She's actually one that translated, she wrote many books. She was a student of Wittgenstein. Certain aspects she does, refine or sharpen, not so much argue per se. But the end of it here is to understand where she's coming from and really have to understand Wittgenstein. So we're going to read 3 passages from Wittgenstein. The first one is, it's 258, right? No, it's Simmons, Steve Kooten. It's like Steve Kooten, whatever, the philosophical investigations. So this is from the 4th edition, which is revised, the latest revised translations from Taka Anscombe. And the actual, she's the one that translated originally, wrote it in German. Either way, so it's what the Wittgenstein is trying to say over here is that there's no such concept of a private language. What's a private language? A private language, by definition, will mean a language which is only for myself. In other words, I'm the one that made up. Basically, it's impossible to make up a personal language to describe things only for yourself. And therefore, by definition, language is a social participation, meaning it is dependent on how it is used in public. That's the way of Akduma. We'll understand a lot more as we go through it. So he says, let's imagine the following case, right? That he wants to say, like he's dependent. Let's say I am going to make up a private language. I'm going to try to label my emotions, my feelings for myself, only by myself, and no one knows, my private diary. Let's imagine the following case. I want to keep a diary about the recurrence of a certain sensation. Right? I feel something, and every time I feel it, I want to write down every time I feel this sensation. So to this end, I associate it with the sign S. I'm going to write a word S every time I feel that sensation. That's how I'm going to label it. I write the sign on a calendar for every day in which I have the sensation. So I first want to observe that the definition of the sign cannot be formulated, right? Because if I'm just explaining it for myself, I can't define it using other things. It's a sensation. It's something which is private, something by myself. I cannot say how it feels because this is, the word S is going to be the definition of what the sensation is. I can't describe it any other way. That's what a label is, right? But all the same, I can give one to myself as a kind of ostensive definition. How? Can I point to the sensation? I can't point to it. The sensation is internal feelings. How am I going to try to write it down? It's just I'm going to focus on it every time, right? Not in the ordinary sense. I can't point to it with a finger, but I speak or write the sign down, and at the same time, I concentrate my attention on the sensation, right? So every time I'm going to write down the word S. While I'm feeling the sensation, I'm going to really, really internalize the sensation that I'm feeling. I'm going to write down S to label, and right now, today, I felt S. And so, as it were, point to it inwardly. Right? So this seems like a very good way of making my own private language. So Wittgenstein, but what is the ceremony for? For that is all there seems to be. A definition serves to lay down the meaning of a sign, doesn't it? Right? Whenever I wanted to define, the meaning of a sign, the S, is what its definition is. That is the whole point of writing down a sign. It's because it carries a meaning, it has a definition. Well, that is done precisely by concentrating my attention, right? So that is how I'm doing it. How am I giving this sign a meaning? By concentrating on what I'm feeling. And then that is how I'm christening this sensation to the letter S. For in this way, I commit to memory the connection between the sign and the sensation. So this seems to be a very simple thing to do. But Zukt Wittgenstein, that is precisely the problem. Because I'm relying, the only way I can go and label this sensation is through my memory. That means every time I want to know if I felt this sensation, I have to rely on my memory, right? But I committed to memory can only mean that this process brings it about that I remember the connection correctly in the future, right? If I'm going to go write down every single time I feel sensation S, I'm going to write down in my diary, on the calendar, I felt S. Now, while I wrote it down, I concentrated very strongly on the sensation. Otherwise, I'm just writing a random sign, a random symbol. I concentrate. I know what I'm feeling, and I'm writing it down. Now, while I write this down, next time I look at this, I'm going to remember what I felt. Right? That's how words actually work. Right? You read a word, I remember this is what it. Right? This is how it was. This is the thing. So I'm relying on my memory to tell me that this is what I felt. But because the sensation is only known through my memory, how do I know that next time I feel the sensation, that this is really the same thing? I have to rely on my memory. I have no outside way of confirming that's what I felt. In that case, that is not a sign. The whole concept of a sign, the whole kind of writing down a symbol is if it can be verified that it's correct. The minute I'm relying on myself that it's correct, I have no way of knowing it's correct. It's like taking a newspaper. I want to know what it's saying. The newspaper is correct. I take another newspaper to see if the same thing is correct. It's the same. You have no idea what one thing is saying. There's no way to outwardly, objectively verify what you are feeling now is the same sensation that you felt then. I mean, every time I write on the S, it can mean complete separate things. Therefore, a private language by myself, for myself, is impossible. Tanit Wittgenstein. I might as well just finish the thing. But I committed to memory can only mean this process brings it about that I remember the connection correctly in the future. But in the present case, the only way I know if something's correctly or not is by relying on my memory. I have no criterion of correctness. One would like to say, whatever is going to seem correct to me is correct. Okay, but in that case, and that only means that here we can't talk about correct. So what I mean to say is the whole concept of a private language that I can label things myself, by myself, is impossible. If that's the case, we're going to jump now to 293, right?
Isn't that a problem in language?
In general, yeah.
Exactly.
Thirsty doesn't always mean the same exact.
Exactly. We'll get to it. That's a problem of language. That's a problem of philosophy of language in general. In truth, we could spend days discussing philosophy of language, but especially when it comes to proper names and the whole, right? I mean, it's something which is, there's a problem. This problem is known as Plato's beard. Why is it called Plato's beard? Because it was sort of mentioned. We're just going to slightly just say why is the problem, but we're not getting into it now because we're just we're just completely lose our point. Why is it called Plato's beard? Because he's the one that mentioned it in the Sophist, and that dialogue, the Sophist, and it grew so tangled through all the centuries. It's called Plato's beard. Well, so the problem over here is how can I think of things that are non-existent? In other words, I say that there is no such thing as a square circle. You know what I mean? There's no such thing as a square circle. But in order to say that there's no such thing as a square circle, you have to have a mental image, or you have to know what I'm talking about. That means that you can know something which doesn't exist, which doesn't seem to make any sense, right?
You're not saying something that the Kalam was saying, in a certain sense.
Yes. To a certain extent, that is the same time, that was the sort of thing that the Sophists seem to have believed, that whatever you say, you make exist. But it's slightly different, because the Kalam, right, I mean, I'm referring again from the Ramban Ein Beis, right, Chalkav Ein Beis. So over there, that basically is, the difference, it is slightly different, because there the thing of saying that whatever you could think of is possible. Right. Not that you're making it exist. The Sophists seem to have said, if you think of if you speak of a flying ship, that means the ship is stuck. There's a flying ship somewhere. It's a similar concept, but it's still slightly different. Therefore, the concept that what is the nimne and what is not possible is still possible. I mean, if you can think of it, it's possible, right? That's the thing. But either way, it's Aristotle, the goat man, whatever. We're not getting into this part now. Maybe one day, we'll see. But right now, language is a big problem, and especially in modernity, whatever it is. But so getting back to Wittgenstein, what's he saying? Right. So now, so the concept of labeling your own private language sensation is impossible. Why? Because the minute you are relying only on yourself, you have absolutely no outside criteria to say if you're saying correct or not. And the minute you can't have it correct or not, well, you lost the whole concept of a label. Doesn't make any sense. So Zukta in 293, if I say to myself that it is only from my own case that I know what the word pain means, now I was going to say basically is, I have pain. How do we know when So the issue over here is, so we understand why I can't have internal language. I have to have external. In other words, when somebody says he's feeling pain, I know what he means, but the pain is dependent ultimately on my internal feeling. I know I'm labeling it. Well, then how does the chodesh a sort of stira? How do these two things square? So this is the famous passage of the beetle in the box. And he says, if I say of myself that it is only from my own case that I know what the word pain means. In other words, it's almost going back to the concept of private language. How do I know what pain means? Because when I felt pain, I labeled it as pain for myself. And because I labeled it for myself as pain, when you say pain, I know it means the same thing, which obviously is a bit of an issue because ultimately I don't know how you felt. But the only way, the issue is both ways. If I didn't feel pain and then label it for myself, then I have no idea what pain means. Mitzvah shiny is, then how do I still know they're both saying the same thing, right? So Plato, the concept of colors, right? They always have the issue with colors. I said this is blue, and you're going to say it's blue also because you're both seeing, but it could be a completely different color. This is the old concept. So now go with language, pain, sensation, feeling, right? So if I say of myself that it is only from my own case that I know what the word pain means, must I not say that of other people too? That they also must only know what pain means because they themselves feel it? And in that case, and how can I generalize the one case so responsibly? So in other words, how can I say then everybody feels pain the same? How can I say everybody feels the same color? It's the same problem. The minute I say that I only know something because I feel it myself, I labeled it for myself, which is again the problem which you read before. In that case, and that's why everybody else knows it. So if everybody knows it because of that reason, then everybody has, it's a private feeling, then how in the world can I say that I know somebody saying about pain? Right? Or at the minute we have no idea what each is saying. Well, everyone tells me that he knows what pain is only from his own case. So that can't be. Why? Suppose that everyone had a box. This box, the nimshal is, I'm going to tell you the nimshal is that it's to the person's mind. Suppose that everyone had a box with something in it, which we call a beetle. He has a box, his mind, and there's something in the mind which is a beetle. Now, no one can ever look into anyone else's box. No one can look into anybody else's box. I have no access privy to anybody else's mind. And everyone says he knows what a beetle is. And everybody, I know exactly what the beetle will have. I know what it is. And what a beetle is only by looking at him. But how? Because I'm looking at his beetle. I look at my beetle, right? This is the problem with pain, right? I don't know what anybody else, what you're feeling. But I know that I know what a beetle is. I know what pain is from your own box. You know what pain is from your own box. And this, I have no access to your box. So here, it will be quite possible for everyone to have something different in this box, right? Very possible. Everybody has a different concept, a different beetle. One might even imagine such a thing constantly changing, right? We're going to go back to the thing before, the S. If I is completely dependent on myself, well, everything can always change. Either way, but what if these people's words beetle had a use nonetheless? So, period. Now, so Lamasa, this is the issue that we're dealing with. So Wittgenstein, it's not an insurmountable problem, because what if these people's word beetle had a use nonetheless? In other words, this is what language means. This is a label. It does have it, even though, because the beetle does not mean your personal sensation. What does it mean? So if so, the only way we can make sense of this would be, it would not be the name of a thing. It is not an actual name of an actual sensation. It's not this S, so what is it? The thing in the box, this beetle, doesn't belong to the language, because the thing which is a personal sensation does not belong to the language game at all. That language game is basically what he calls the concept of language, the laws of language, whatever. I don't want to get too much into his theory of language right now. The point is saying here is, the concept of this beetle, which I have no access to, you have no access to mine, thing is, does not exist in language as such. We cannot formulate it, does not mean there is no such concept of something which you cannot express. And this is a problem which befrat, many people think concept, Wittgenstein at the end of the book said basically is that what we can, religion is, the point I'm saying here is, yes, there are sensations, private things which cannot be put into language, because the definition of language has to be a communal event. Let's continue, whatever. We'll say it in a minute. If so let's go back to the line. One might even imagine, end of the day here is, that such a thing constantly changes. So, but what if these people's word beetle had to use nonetheless? Let's say it's language. If so, if we say that beetle does mean something, then it's not my personal feeling. What then is it? If so, it will not be as a name of a thing, I may not be naming something for myself. The thing in the box doesn't belong to the language game at all. What is a personal feeling does not belong in language. It's not what language expresses. Language does not express my personal feeling. not even as a something, right? Because the box might even be empty. I don't know if there's I have no label for it whatsoever. No one can divide through, it's referring to me like the common denominator counts, whatever it is, by the thing in the box. It cancels out whatever it is. Whatever the person thinks is, as far as language, as far as discussion, as far as human social interaction, does not exist in that sense. That is to say, if we construe the grammar of the expression of sensation on the model of object and name, and we say that whenever I say that I feel something, that's an object and I'm labeling it, the object, my personal thing, drops out. The object drops out, and consideration, out of consideration as irrelevant. In other words, let's say, so when a child says that he feels pain, the actual sensation, that's not it. He cannot describe what he feels prior to language. What language then does and says, it labels a sensation, and therefore, all it does is it's a fetus. What's the word? It directs it. It directs it to a certain meaning. And when we say pain, that is what we're referring to. That's sheer social thing. Somebody that feel pain, let me say whether they need comfort, they need help, or all these things. So it is not a sensation, a personal sensation as such, which is impossible. Yet eventually we learn to associate certain things with labels, and then it takes on a whole new meaning and is never labeled a private name. S is impossible to label because there's no way to correlate, there's no way to discuss it because there's no actual, it's not part of the language game. The language game is simply the part that as a social body, we all participate. When you say you're feeling sad, I know what you mean, not this, and it's more, not only is the thing, it directs your own emotion also. That is the chap over here. Not only does the actual, but it has no label, you can't express. But when we hear eventually, yes, you express it through these labels, and it also directs your emotion. Does not mean there's no private emotion can be. But as far as the language is concerned, as far as understanding, as far as being able to speak and discuss with other people, there are certain labels which then go, and it tells me how the reaction. In other words, your outside reactions, how you act, is what language is. We have a problem. So Wittgenstein was then accused of being a behaviorist. If what you're feeling prior to language cannot be spoken of, cannot be shared with others, it is simply the private label, it's basically the outward behavior, the actions and how you interact and how I see it on your face and how you work with it is what is actually language, is how we interact. Well, then aren't you a regular behaviorist? Yes, so that was a big thing, something which Wittgenstein did not want to be labeled at because he felt that it was extremely wrong. Precisely, we're going to get to why. So now we're going to go to the last part, which is 308. And here, so let's go 307. So he was accused, again, this is like a Talmud, whatever, it's like a questioner and answers. It says, so according to your understanding of language, so if in 307, was he accused, aren't you nevertheless a behaviorist in disguise? According to what you're defining human action and behavior, part of the language game, it was a participation in rules, and that's what forms the person in the senses that that's how we deal and that's how we understand things. Well, then aren't you nevertheless a behaviorist in disguise? Aren't you nevertheless basically saying that everything except human behavior is a fiction? Because the private feeling, the S, well, we don't think it's private language, so it's only as far as it is a social action. Well, in that case, you're literally a behaviorist in disguise. Nope, absolutely not. If I speak of a fiction, then it's of a grammatical fiction. The only reason why you even think this concept of behavior is because we completely misunderstood the whole concept of language, the whole understanding, the whole concept of a human being, of a person. It's a mistake which arose because of a grammatical fiction. What is a grammatical fiction? 308. How does this philosophical problem about mental processes and states and about behaviorism arise, right? What is the dichotomy? We just spoke before. The Cartesian problem over here is we have the problem of mental states, which is the feeling the human has, and then we have the problem, and then we have the behaviorism, the external actions. Why did this problem to begin with arise? As Wittgenstein, How does this philosophical problem about mental processes and states and about behaviorism arise? Right, these are the two dichotomies: mental processes and states, the emotions, right, and the behaviorism, the outside actions. How did this dichotomy b'chlal arise? The first step is one that altogether escapes notice. Nobody even realizes why. We talk about processes and states. We talk about processes and states, which is the internal human feelings, and we think about as they actually exist. We say it as a noun. It is a feeling. Anger, it's a noun. It's a state of being. We speak about actually there is an existence of this state of being. Therefore, it has a real action, a real something. It exists. And then we have a problem. We don't fully understand what it means. And we talk about processes and states and leave their nature undecided. We don't know what it is yet, right? But we treat it as an actual entity which exists. Sometimes, perhaps, we'll know more about them. Hopefully, one day we'll know more about them, we think. But that's just what commits us to a particular way of looking at the matter. We view it as an actual, concrete thing. Anger exists as a concrete action. Emotions feel as concrete as a thing inside, internally in the person, in the human being as such. And we're trying to understand more what it is. Right? We have a certain conception of what it means to learn how to process better. Look at science. It's a regular science is the thing about things that exist externally, concretely. Right? That's what science is. And therefore, we get better and better. But the decisive movement in the conjuring trick on pretending there is this problem of an internal and a behavioralist action, and that's made by this trick, has been made just by speaking about the internal motion as it actually exists. And it was the very one that seemed to us quite innocent. And now, the analogy, which was to make us understand our thoughts, falls to pieces. It's such as grammar, this whole thing of treating the mental process as concrete, falls to pieces. So we have to deny the as yet uncomprehended process in the yet unexplored medium. The only we don't get anywhere by just explaining the intentions. We don't even know what that means. We have no concrete way of understanding what it means. So in order to do that, we have to deny the concept that the internal actions exist as a private experience of the human being in the as yet unexplored medium. And we go then what? If we deny it, we're going to go to behavioralism as the external actions. And now it looks as if we had denied mental processes. We deny the concept that a mental process even exists, and naturally, and only thing that exists is external behavior. And naturally, we don't want to deny them. It's like Wittgenstein. I'm not trying to deny a mental process. Of course not. What I'm denying over here is the concept that what I'm denying is behavioralism, that only the outside actions matter. I'm saying the outside actions are dependent on the internal matter. However, it is shaped by a form of a social, of language, of a language game. What does he mean? So, we bring this all together. We can't go into any more of this, obviously. No, didn't print it anymore, there's no time. But as what exactly he's saying? So we have language by definition is something which is a label certain thing, and therefore it directs the person, and we understand what the person means. However, it is not external, only the external matter. He's not a behaviorist, because why not? Because the understanding of a behavioralist, the understanding that there's a concept of behavioralist comes from a misunderstanding. It comes from accepting the dichotomy of internal and external. And saying is, I can't understand the internal because the anger as nouns, as things that actually exist. I'm going to deny those things that they express and say that the only thing that actually exists, anger, is an outward motion. If I deny the whole concept of this dichotomy, of a split between the internal and the external, the problem of behavioralism, the thing they're trying to think, never arises. Why? Because there's no such thing as a neutral action. The action itself, in other words, you do the same thing and it's dependent on how it is structured in language. I could do the same thing. I could get the zelbe tzeduk, I could get the same. I could lift. We go down Anscombe in the whole. Okay, I got late. I could give the same thing as tzedukah. I could give a person money. I could write a check. Now, in itself, the action, which for behaviors, that's really what it is. It's just some external action. Is not true. There's no such thing as, I have no idea what the check is. I have no idea what writing a thing means. It could be paying a bill. It could be tzedukah. It could be that you're trying to hurt somebody. It could be you're trying to, the thing that means absolutely nothing. It is only in the context, in the social context, and understanding what the internal state in the social context means, that has any meaning. Now, in other words, it is not my internal good feeling, which is indescribable, which makes it an action as it is. But it's not just the outside behavior which makes an action either. It's an internal understanding of my participation in the language game, in the society, in the community, what this action means. That is what then defines the action. Murder, if a court kills a person, it is not murder, because as far as we're going to get this concept of law, I have to get into a different time. I mean, maybe next week. But as far as if a court kills somebody, it doesn't mean it's not murder. But if a person kills them, it is murder. Same action. Why not? Because of how it is placed in the world, in the language game, in the thing. There's no such thing as a neutral action. Every action is defined by its internal state and understanding of how it is in outside the world. Anscombe, when she speaks about intention and explains the whole, we're not going to go through obviously the whole book over here, it's actually 94 pages, I believe. But if we go through the whole, but the point over here is the thing that what makes a thing kavuna has to do with, we can answer the question of why, but it's more than that, just meaning just saying why you're doing it. It's an understanding in the social context of what the action itself means. Again, there's no such thing as doing a mass mitzvah. No such thing as a Torah-form, which is inherently good. There is no such thing. If I'm just skipping to the whole thing because it got late, but I want to be more this.
No, I'd like to list the whole thing. So if it's too late, I have time. But
no.
Next week, then we can do that too.
Had other things for next week already. Let me see what's important. So now, with this understanding, let's go back to the Chinuch. So the Chinuch zogt as was that there is the concept of that you do an action and therefore, right? So the basic behavioral understanding will be is that there's a Torah-form doing a mitzvah, and that is going to eventually do the mitzvah as a mitzvah. But we're going to understand there's no such thing as a Torah-digger form of mitzvah without it coming from somewhere, without it having been interpreted in the person's own thing, in the social world, in his in the language game which he participates. Let me not say it's a symbolic order.
Torah is also involved in the language game, and you can't
define
anything without the language game.
It
involves the social understanding of the language.
Yes. But more than also, it's not that it is also. There's only understanding in language, and language by definition is a language game. No such thing as a private language. And understanding by definition is only through language, and language cannot be a private language. It cannot be something which can only label by itself. Because then there's absolutely no. It doesn't. It means it's you don't have the problem of the law. Language only words. What? But when I say something, you know what it means. If I can say something and it means completely different. If I say bread and I mean run, then we have no thing, right? Only way we can have any single interaction, right? The thing of the law of excluded middle, the law of identity, right? That's if we both mean the same thing. Otherwise, there's no way of having a discussion. The minute it becomes private language, even for myself, I have no way of labeling it. I have to use my own understanding, myself for verification, which is impossible. Right? That's it. So there is not understanding by definition must partake in language, and language as such. Now again, maybe we want to begin to exactly where this is more about how Aristotle understands language, what happened, why it changed the thing, but Wittgenstein's understanding of language, which, as far as we're concerned right now, is accurate, is correct for this concept, kapunim. It means that everything participates in language because that's how we understand anything. And language by definition is not private, it's just social. And that is how the world as such, as how society, everything is built through a language game. And that's why you can have different rules and we'll get to it maybe a different time, more bariches. So now we can understand the proper what's lishma and not lishma. Right? So Chazal talk lishma, bu lishma. The issue over here is it's a basha, it's a minute you do lishma, so you should always have lishma. I mean, eventually you should always have lishma. But the way we just explained it is there's no such thing as learning Torah in a neutral learn Torah. And Torah by definition of Torah, right? And if you learn Torah, and eventually you're going to always learn lishma. There is no such thing, because what exactly is the definition of learning Torah? Where is it? So, Stamazoi, let's go back to the last thing. Right? Stamazoi, what do you mean by learning Shaloi Lishma? Learning Shaloi Lishma means you're learning for COVID, you're learning for thing and the content. And Alpha Bekain is Shaloi Lishma, and eventually you get Lishma to learn normally, right? So the way we explained it last week, we should understand it. I think we should understand a lot better right now. There is no such thing as that is not learning Torah. That's not the form of learning Torah. That is a whole different concept of learning Torah, right? So, exactly. So the Torah, the learning shaloi lishma, which what I mean say is that we said that you have no motivation for doing it. So you asked the question last week. Amasa Pashas, we're combining two different aspects. The Chinuch is saying you're not in the mood of doing, you don't want to do it, you're not interested, whatever reason. The period is saying is you don't want to do it because you're afraid, because you don't want to, you know you're not doing lishma and you can't make yourself to do it, shaloi lishma. So two different motivations of not wanting to do it, and that is correct. However, the word which makes the shaloi lishma reach the lishma is a recognition that you're doing it b'kabulas omach shmaim. So the motivation of not wanting to do it is not relevant. It is the motivation of wanting to do it, because the not wanting to do it is not what is causing the action. It's not what describing the action. The description of the action of learning is the concept of kabulas omach shmaim. So whether I don't want to do it because I don't feel that I'm doing it for the correct reason, or if I don't want to do it because I am not in the mood, my action of doing it, the doing shaloi lishma, is the form of kabulas omach shmaim, and that will lead to lishma, because you're doing it the Torah, the form of lishma. So you're right that the motivation of not doing it might be correct, but it's not the not doing it which makes it lishma. It is the doing it, and the doing it is what omach shmaim, and that is a connection.
So what is this rule?
That it's already late. Well, now let's go back to the lecturer's the mistake which he made. So now he's trying to say that he doesn't realize he's literally being a behaviorist over here. And he wants to I don't believe he wants to be a behaviorist. He's trying to say that the behavior, right, by doing it, you're going to train the nefesh, you can train the neshama, the nefesh, the person to be a better person, right? But guess what? That's what behaviorists believe too. The question over here is, do we believe, a behaviorist also believes that the external action retrains the nefesh, retrains the mind, the cycle, right? They're saying again, we have the dichotomy, we have the inwards, we have the outwards. The outwards is ununderstandable, the inwards is not understandable, the outwards is what we know, and the outwards then retrains the inside. That is what the behaviorist says. What is he saying? He's saying the exact same thing. I'm going to do the Torah-form of learning, the Torah-form of the mitzvah, and that is going to retrain what? It's going to train the person to do it again. The outside is going to retrain the inside. What he missed over here is, he completely missed the source of what exactly makes it an action of Torah. There's no such thing as a Torah for it. There's no such thing as doing a neutral action. No action is neutral, no action is Kedisha, no action is non-Kedisha. I mean, there is a concept of non-Kedisha, obviously, if it's Timur. That's, again, we'll get to that a different time. What I'm saying here, no such thing is not a neutral concept of doing a mitzvah, a Kedisha concept. What is the definition? Define the mitzvah, define what it means to do a mitzvah, define what makes this a mitzvah in the language game, in the social order, where you are, right? So what he basically is, this is his logical step. So the Torah says there's X and there's Y. X is allowed, Y is not allowed. Therefore, Y is quantitatively, it's a mehus, it's andrish, it's different from X. And therefore, you do X, you're going to get to Y. But the problem over here is it's not a logical, it's not a logical conclusion. It's three separate claims. And it does not mean you have to define what it means to do X, right? Does that mean that everything the Torah says that you're not allowed to eat treif, you're allowed to eat kasher? So if you eat kashrus, you become a better person. How does that follow? Does that mean that the form of eating kashrus itself is a Torah form? It is a mutadiga thing if done under the correct description of what is considered for the Torah. So we eat it that because telos, right? If I go and I say that everything has a form, everything has a reason itself, and that is what makes it thing. Now he made a category mistake by jumping between the concepts. Telos of a tree is definitional. Telos of a law is not definitional. There's many different laws. There's many different reasons for laws. Some are ceremonial. Some are.
That's what I wanted. That's what I wanted to ask right at the beginning. If you have a thing, a table, the telos are there. The tree. But to say that you make a law, you have to do kak, and to say that the telos is to do kak, I think it's asinine.
It is, but because he's coming from a behavioralist perspective. Now, sorry, behavior says repeat the behavior and the pattern is formed. He's saying a Torah concept of behavioralism. Repeat the teleological Torah form, whatever that means, and then nefesh is formed, right? But the problem over here is we still need to answer from which motivation was the action done, because that is what defines the action. See, the problem here is intention is dependent on the motivation. That is clearly, if you go through the book from Elizabeth Anscombe, read intention, you'll see clearly. And she's coming from Wittgenstein. There's no such thing as a neutral action which does not participate of the social construct of how it's constructed in a social order. There's no such thing as saying is that from the motivation, the understanding where it comes from, that is what defines the action for what it is. There's no such thing as doing, I'm going to go give tzedukah and therefore I'm coming to it. No, tzedukah is a certain form of doing a certain way with a certain kavuna, a certain understanding of what you're doing. That's what makes it. Shaloi l'shma misay, you understand that you're doing it, that's what Hashem said. If you're doing it because I want to go and be called a roof, that is not the learning of Torah which Hashem told you to do, and therefore it is not necessarily bring the Shaloi l'shma, brings you l'shma. So therefore, it's just complete misunderstanding of Anscombe's definition of intention, which means to say is that the intention is what defines the act. Not that, yes, so he read Anscombe, and it's like Anscombe says that it's not the internal emotive feeling of a sahavas which makes an act intentional, which makes an act. Correct. But it does not mean that the behavioral, the external act itself is an act. What it means to say is that there is the intention, the understanding where it's coming from that makes it what it is. If you lift up your arm to go pour poison in the well of a thing, if you don't understand, if you don't have a mind of doing it, you have no idea what it is, that's not called an intentional act. If you understand what you do, that's called intentional act. I mean, that's whatever. So that's one, the mushal, the Department of Water for Nazis, whatever it is. That's the one, the mushal across the whole book. I mean, 3 places, whatever it is. But the point of it here is, again, the fact is that you're writing Anscombe in the book Intention. You say that's something that mushal. But again, it's a basic thing. If it's not a magic thing, you write Geb Tzedukah. If you write give that it's called tzedukah. Yes, she fights against the concept of an internal, complete private concept. That is what makes of intention of feeling. Correct. Does not mean that the action itself, without understanding where it's coming from, which defines what the action is. The point over here is the definition of the action is not internal. There's no such thing as telos in an action which is given by something. There is a certain way it has to be. No. Again, we have to go. We have to venture to master. Is do I'm looking for them or niche? That's all type of discussion. But now we understand again. We're not going to have time now to get into the defense, but to explain the Ramban. But now understand definitely what the Ramban is saying. The Ramban is saying over here is it's not a matter of quantity or quantity. It has to do with the form of the mitzvah. If you're doing, you could eat, you could be menivel b'shas Torah, because it's not the concept of eating kosher which makes you doing the Torah. Is the form, the correct approach to it is what makes it a Torah de Gemasa. There is no such floating Torah de Gemasa external. That is behaviorism. A concept that the complete action which then redoes it into. It's the internal thing which defines what the action is. That is what the Ramban is saying. Be more careful when they speak to the Rishonim. Either way, this is basically the point. I mean, there is ought distinction also, which it's such a misunderstanding. The famous problem, the human right, is ought. What is ought? Is ought is basically from is you can't get an ought. It means to say is that because something is good, you have to go do it. That is basically what the question over here. That's the simple understanding of the question over here. So now once I say that there is what the definition of is good, a good watch. I mean, we'll use the watch because it's simple, right? Say a good watch. It's not moral, but whatever it is. I give the mushal of the watch, right? He's saying here that a good watch it tells time correctly. So therefore, a good watch should be saying the good time. So Hume is saying that because something is like that doesn't mean, this is the basic understanding of Hume. Because something is good, a good watch means it should tell time. That's what it is. Doesn't mean that you should do it. That it should be telling time correctly. From it is, you don't get it ought. So that according to if I read Shai Telos in the Dach in Igmul, is now I can understand that there's no question. Why? Because it is the definition of what it is. So I mean you don't have to go do it. But that is what definition, right?
Is what?
is by definition is the ought, right? So now, where did he get this from? Anscombe wrote a very, very famous paper actually. It's one of that known as understanding modern moral theory. And it's a complete misunderstanding of what she's saying. It's really the same problem again. He's jumping from telos to therapeutic method. He completely skips the metapsychology. That's basically what we were saying before. The concept over here is that, I just said because the limits is not the bets and not in the guide to we're trying to bring out today. That yes, it is correct. But there is a definition. Is the definition of the thing. Hume is saying a completely different thing. He's saying over here, and this is what Anscombe says clearly in the thing itself, that the question of the word ought, which takes on the moral thing. In other words, we'll try to in 2 minutes. We can say it as a get as nish, but it is really the guide to the point that we brought up thinking of to law, and we got much next week if plans don't change. But it gets in the minutes. What Hume is telling, there's is and then there's a ought. He's saying over here is ought is a moral concept. Is a feeling of it should. This is what Hume is saying. Hume is not just saying over here. He's saying is that the concept is even if we define that the good is definitional. In other words, what makes it good is definitional. A good human is one that does whatever is best for his flourishing. Great, right? Is a ought. Ultimately, the moral imperative of ought, this feeling that you really should do it, does not follow from is. As Anscombe says, according to Hume, the Cartesian question is does not equal to nothing. In other words, it is a definition, but not as a law. In other words, it says you have to jetson you have to let go this old concept of ought, which is an old moral concept from divine law theory, or not that I believe in God, because it's also, in other words, that it's a moral concept which comes from an imperative. That is a part where you have to. So in other words, has to be a brute fact, really means say yes. In other words, you say if I'm going to go buy, so the Yom Tana does I'm going to go to the store at the bridge. Right? If I'm buying a pound of potatoes, and it says therefore I bought you potatoes, and I owe you money. It has nothing to tell me that I should go pay you money. Right? That is really what Hume is saying. You know, there's no difference between saying that 20 quid is a pound. I'm assuming that's what it is. That's what it says in the paper. But 20 quid is a pound, and it's been 1958, I think. So maybe then it was 5 Either 20 quid is a pound. The only thing it's saying is that I bought a pound of potatoes, and I owe you a quid or whatever it is, whatever the amount is. In other words, the both are saying is a statement of fact. It's a statement of something what it is. It doesn't tell you what you should do, right? So, Zukt Anscombe. Again, this is the answer is because you have to understand it's the same thing we're just discussing until now. That's why it's in the guide. In other words, taking by itself, if you're going to tell me the description of fact, but the word buying itself is definitional, meaning that you owe me money, because the buying is only understood as known as brute fact, only within the social context of what buying, delivering, and giving. So in other words, you're correct. So ought as in the moral, this feeling, yes, but we have to jetson that concept until we have a psychology of actual whatever feeling, whatever it is, or you believe in a God that mandated. He said it came from Judaism, or came from the Christian, or from even the Stoics. Concept that there is ultimately a divine law theory. That's the ought thing. In other words, it's two-step thing. You're correct that ought, the moral feeling niche. The other definition concept is looked at is because the concept of buying means you owe money. That's what it means. It's only understood through the context. So the whole concept of tilo is completely misunderstanding. Everything was messed up. But with Nagaya, to our discussion over here, is precisely what we are trying to explain until now. There is no such thing as a neutral action. There is no such thing as a neutral. Every action comes from somewhere, and that word comes from is what defines the action as such. There's no such thing as the Torah-Form. Torah-Form is only defined by done through the correct motivation. That's what Shaloi Lishma means, that I bring to Lishma.